The issue of decoloniality, decolonizing the curriculum, has certainly been a topical one for some time, and certainly since the student protests of 2015 and 2016 has been an issue that we can't ignore in our current environment. And so we are trying to grapple with what that means across all spheres in higher education. A lot more in higher education than actually at the schooling level, and I think that's still to come. But as you say, Chris, in language and literacy education, this is something that we have been grappling with for quite some time, as we think, for example, in South Africa and further afield in Africa, about the role of missionaries in the colonial construction of the particular African languages as they named in the South African Constitution. And also we know Ngugi wa Thiong'o's very famous work, on decolonizing the mind, where he speaks about the powerful role of language in terms of actually capturing people's spirits and breaking down those spirits in exercising power over them. And that was in the 80s. So we have got a history of working in this area, but clearly haven't had enough impact, because we wouldn't be sitting in a situation where the power of English is so dominant and growing if we had been making that kind of impact. So the issues of language have not had the attention that they need to have. And I'm going to argue today that really a lot of that is about language ideologies, about the way that language ideologies have taken hold globally, locally, in the way that we accept things as normal, as normative, which are actually completely unacceptable, which break people's rights to quality education on a daily basis. And yet, because those ideologies have got such a stronghold, we end up actually accepting them. So I'm going to start by talking about decoloniality and coloniality just briefly, and what I'm thinking of, the resources I'm using in using that term. And then from there, I'm going to talk about language ideologies and what those are, and the three dominant language ideologies that I think that we really have to grapple with, because if we don't actually engage with those, we won't be able to shift our thinking so that we can work very differently in a decolonial way. So those are the ideology of language itself and the social construction of language as a pure, autonomous and bounded entity. The power of monoglossic ideologies, in other words, the expectation that the normal speaker is monolingual and proficient in one language, and that multilingualism is not the norm, is in fact some kind of a problem. And then the third one, which I've called Anglo-normativity, which is about not just the dominance of English, but the expectations that go along with that dominance, and the way, the consequences of that for speakers of languages other than English and for multilingual speakers. So in taking you through those three different ideologies, I want to show some data which questions the idea of what languages are, how we separate languages from each other. I also want to show some data on what happens in the classroom around language ideologies, and how that feeds on to higher education. Oh, I was getting into my swing there. You see, I can talk for 40 minutes and you just have to sit. How horrible. And although this is a higher education setting, I will be drawing on data right from grade 1 classrooms up through the system, because I do believe that when we're thinking about language ideologies, we can't just start with thinking about what comes when students arrive at universities and into higher education institutions. We actually need to see where they've come from and what people have been socialized into as young children. So that's my argument for why I hope you'll bear with me that I do show you a little bit of data from school environments along the way today. The final part of the talk will be looking at alternatives. Let me just find my presentation. There we go. Okay, I hope that's a more interesting start than my standing here. Interesting but depressing. I don't know if you recognize that image. The people who are from Cape Town may remember the school protests that took place at Sanssouci and then in other schools around Cape Town following the Pretoria Girls' School protests. Towards the latter part of last year. And what you see in this image is a picture of a merit and demerit book that one of the Sanssouci girls is holding up to the fence. You can see the green, the crisscross wire, plastic wire meshing. You can see her hand. And my arrow is pointing down to the demerit that she got. It's merits on the far column and demerits on the inner column. For speaking not English. It says not English in brackets, talk. So it's not even necessary to put what the language is that the person is speaking. The fact that they're not speaking English in the environment is enough for them to get a demerit. So in this sense, for me, this image really points to the power of coloniality in shaping what counts as legitimate language practices in South African education, whether this is in schools or in higher education. So colonial constructs of language, I'm going to argue, are at the heart of the pervasive inequalities in our education system, across the system. And I want to show how the colonial legacy renders invisible the language resources of the majority of our learners in South Africa. So that's one example of it. When it comes to the ideas of coloniality that I am drawing on in my use of the word decoloniality, I am drawing on the Latin American theorists as well as African theorists like Ndlovu Gacheni and Ngugi, Mignolo, Maldonado Torres, in explaining to us how coloniality is in fact the flip side, or what Mignolo calls the darker side of Western modernity. So Mignolo, in his book, The Darker Side of Western Modernity, he argues that the system of modernity itself is dependent on the processes of colonialism and extraction and exploitation that took place. And that in fact, the current idea that there are first world countries and the third world is developing and marching towards becoming first world is a myth, because in fact one cannot reach that kind of a modernity without the kinds of darker side of extraction, exploitation, and so on. So that's the argument that Mignolo makes. And I think Maldonado Torres puts it very well in his own words, so I'm not going to try and do better than him in explaining how coloniality is different from colonialism. As he says, colonialism denotes a political and economic relation in which the sovereignty of a nation or a people rests on the power of another nation, which makes such nation an empire. Coloniality, instead, refers to long-standing patterns of power that emerged as a result of colonialism, but that define culture, labor, intersubjective relations, and knowledge production well beyond the strict limits of colonial administrations. Thus, coloniality survives colonialism. It is maintained alive in books, in the criteria for academic performance, in cultural patterns, in common sense, in the self-image of peoples, in aspiration of self, and so many other aspects of our modern experience. In a way, as modern subjects, we breathe coloniality all the time and every day. Moving to decoloniality, Maldonado Torres talks about a decolonial turn, and he talks about how in the process of decoloniality we need to be making visible what has been rendered invisible. And of course, when that comes to knowledge, when it comes to language, that's very much at the heart of what we are concerned with here. So he argues that the decolonial turn is about making visible the invisible and analyzing the mechanisms that produce such invisibility or distorted visibility in light of a large stock of ideas that must necessarily include the critical reflections of the invisible people themselves. So part of what I'm doing in the first part of my talk today is to actually make visible some of these mechanisms that work through language ideologies to displace and to render invisible the people's language resources. I like to just get people to think about who the imagined learner is in our general curriculum and language policy as it's implemented in South African schools. So for the majority of our learners, they take supposedly home language instruction or mother tongue from grade 1 to grade 3. Although if they speak a different variety from what is being taught as the standard in school, they would not necessarily even have home language, right? And then they have 2 to 3 hours of English first additional language in their first 2 years, increasing to 3 to 4 hours of English first additional language in their grade 3 year. And then when they move on to grade 4, there is a complete immersion, supposedly, where every single textbook, every single assessment, all learning materials, and all teaching and learning is supposed to happen in English. That's the case for the majority of our learners. There are also some learners who continue on with Afrikaans, but it's either the one or the other. Now, although in practice, in oral discourse, we find that that's not necessarily the case, those children have to write exactly the same assessments, which are very often distributed from district offices. They're not even controlled by the school, as the children who are coming into school with English as a home language in suburban schools in the leafy suburbs across South Africa. There is no difference in the assessments that they have to write, in the textbooks that they have to work with. And I wonder if we can just imagine for a moment what white middle-class English and Afrikaans-speaking parents would say if their children, after learning 2 to 3 hours of isiXhosa a week in grade 1 and 2, and then 3 to 4 hours of isiXhosa a week in grade 3, would suddenly in grade 4 have all their curriculum materials, all their assessments, everything in isiXhosa. Would those parents allow that? Would they? I mean, if we're honest, would they? No. So why then do we accept this for the majority of our children in the country? When we think about it like that, it seems absurd. How can it be possible that children have got such unequal experiences in our current schooling system? There's the question, how is it possible that the most valuable resource a child brings to schooling, language, is consistently rendered invisible and recast as a problem? So partly what I'm arguing in this first part is that this is as a result of dominant language ideologies. What do I mean by language ideologies? I mean the sets of beliefs, the values, the cultural frames that are circulating in society and informing the ways in which language itself is conceptualized and represented, as well as how it's used, and as well as the judgments that we make about different languages, about people's language use. So there are three ideologies, as I mentioned when I was buying time at the beginning, that I want to look at. The one is this notion of language as pure autonomous and bounded entities, and then monoglossic ideologies and Anglo-normativity. So for the first ideology, languages as pure autonomous and bounded entities. For some time now in linguistics and critical sociolinguistics, there has been the recognition that in fact language as an entity where we name a language, English, Afrikaans, isiXhosa, begins here and ends here, and we can confidently say this set of resources is this language, is actually itself a social construct, right? So there is no biological entity for that language in the head. There's no pre-wired biological capacity for a specific named language. Humans have named the resources that we use into different languages and have described the systems that exist. So we ourselves have constructed that, much as we have constructed race in the sense that we know that genetically we can't find a race gene, and there's more difference in genes between people in races than across races. But socially, we have constructed those categories, and they have very real consequences, very real material effects. And that's the same with languages, that we can say they're constructed, but in fact, the fact that they're constructed in particular ways are the reality that we have to deal with currently. But let's look at what happens in terms of language separation and seeing what at language use at the boundaries. So on the one side, I've got, on your right-hand side, the extract 1.1 is drawn from Margie Probin's research in grade 8 science classrooms. And there the teacher is speaking and she's saying to the learners, and then Kingo Kukutiwe, the maggots help to break down the dead plant or animal material. Okay, you can see that what she's doing there is switching between the isiXhosa resources, Kingo Kukutiwe, and the English resources. She's working with a textbook, and so she's pointing to the textbook and saying to the learners, and then it says, and then reading from the textbook, right? So it's fairly clear, I think, to identify the resources that are named as English and isiXhosa in that particular example of language use. If we look at the one on the other side, this comes from McKinney and Mashiri, and they are researching instances of what they've called in the article Chi Harari, where the bus conductor in Harare is talking to passengers and he says, "Ma passengers, Yumani Mokiu, Mosachita Zachigororo, and Pindai Tinde Muface." So in these particular examples, translated as passengers, okay, you can see ma passengers. It's got the plural from an Nguni language form, ma, at the front, but then a lexical item that's very similar to English. We also see that in Mokiu, right? Kiu, a Q. We could talk about Muface maybe as coming from a colloquial, as somebody who's my friend or my acquaintance face. But we've also got Chishona in there as well. And in this particular example, it's actually very difficult to say, well, this word belongs to this language, or this word belongs to that language, because in fact, the different elements of the language have been fused together in this communication. So what McKinney et al. Call this is a new urban vernacular. The elements, this particular speaker is not necessarily fluent in these language resources separately. His usage of this language is as one communicative repertoire. They are fused into this urban vernacular, right? Whereas the teacher in the extract 1.1 has got the bilingual proficiency in 2 languages and will be able to say, not necessarily conscious when you're doing it, but would be able to say, looking at a transcription, yes, there I'm using English, there I'm using isiXhosa. Okay, let's look at this example. So here, this example is from my own research in a girls-only school in Johannesburg, where all the learners were African and spoke African languages, but they were schooled through English. Most of the teachers were mainly white. So a former Model C school that now has only black learners in it. And the girls in this particular grade 10 class were doing an English oral, and one of the girls had made a mistake, not in terms of pronunciation, though whether that's a mistake is another issue we'll get to, but in terms of the word that she said. So she said, I think, animals, and then she was corrected by one of the girls in the audience, in the class, who said apples, and then the child who was speaking, standing in front, the grade 10, said, oh, sorry, apples. And then her friend, who had originally corrected her, Catherine, she was sitting at the back, and I was sitting behind her. So it was quite quiet, wasn't loudly for the whole class or for the teacher to hear, but was ready to hear. She said, hi, too late. And they were laughing in that environment. So when I was coding this, I had to, and analyzing it as part of my data analysis, I was thinking, well, what is this? Is this a use of urbanized isiZulu? Okay, hi, no. And the too late, with using the vowel sounds coming from the isiZulu, because the goose vowel in two would be fronted in a white South African English accent, to, and back in a black South African English accent, to, right? The difference, you can hear fronting in the mouth or back, to. So, or is this a switch between isiZulu and English? I don't know. In fact, does it matter? Because what the child is doing here is playful. She certainly can speak with a Model C accent. She can also speak isiZulu fluently, and she can switch in fluid ways in order to make meaning in a playful way, and to say to her peer, you know, I'm being the teacher here, but I'm not really a teacher. I'm still your friend, right? So what we see is that we've got a plethora of new languages of description that have developed in applied linguistics and in sociolinguistics to try to make sense of the fact that languages do not stay inside boxes. When you describe language use from everyday, language practices in everyday life, in fact, those language boxes become far less clear-cut. And I'm not going to explain all of these because it would take too long, but I just wanted to give you a flavor of the range of terms that's out there. Some of you will be very familiar with these, and others maybe less so. So Bush and Blommet talk about linguistic repertoires. Jorgensen in Denmark about polylanguaging. Otsuji and Pennycook in Australia, metrolingualism. Kanagaraja and Trimber, that should be, in Horner, translingualism. Rampton talked about crossing. There's the urban vernaculars, like the example of Chiharari. And then translanguaging and Ubuntu translanguaging. And I'm going to come back to the term translanguaging later, because that's the term that has been taken up most in educational settings or pedagogical settings. But what we can see is that when you have an explosion of new languages of description, it's showing that in different parts of the world, people working with real-life language data are arguing that, in fact, our language of description with code switching, where you can see clearly 2 codes or 3 codes and more, is no longer adequate to describe the language practices around us. So the second ideology that I want to go on to now is the idea of monolingualism, or monoglossic ideology. So this is the idea that being proficient in a single named language, and in our country and in many others, most often English, is the norm. That's the norm, and that's what other people are judged against. They are treated as if they are monolinguals. Now we see that this particular problem has been a huge problem for the science that's created, the knowledge that's created in the discipline of applied linguistics and psycholinguistics. the fact that people talk about first language acquisition, second language acquisition, we have whole journals, studies in second language acquisition, is founded on the myth that the normal speaker is monolingual from birth and only learns an additional language once they get into a formal schooling learning environment, where we know, in fact, that the majority of the population around the world is multilingual, and many, many children grow up multilingually, bilingually, from birth. So in fact, it's actually second language acquisition at a later stage in school, which is the exception, rather than the norm. Bilingualism and multilingualism is the norm. And yet, that colonial construction of monolingualism as the norm has underpinned most of the research on language acquisition, both in first language acquisition and what's so-called second language acquisition, which many authors are now arguing needs to actually be called multilingual language acquisition and language acquisition rather than first language acquisition. The other idea that follows from this is that nations are made up of one language, one nation, one geographical territory. That linguistic purity is inherently superior, or good language use keeps named languages separate from each other, while deficient language use is mixed. And I think in our own context, there are some quite chilling kind of connotations of racial purity and mixing. That mixing, cultural mixing, is not a good idea, is a hangover from the way that apartheid worked to divide people up ethnically with ethno-linguistic categories. By multilingualism understood as multiple monolingualism. So the idea that the goal is balanced bilingualism, that you have the same kind of proficiency in one language as another. We can never have exactly the same proficiency in one language from another, because languages are different from each other, even if we use them in similar purposes, for similar purposes. We are not necessarily going to have the same knowledge in one set of named language as we are in another, and that's not a problem. And then finally, this idea that multilingualism or bilingualism is a problem. So this is another set of language ideologies related to monolingualism as the norm that I am arguing is very powerful in our thinking, even when we want to believe that multilingualism is positive. At the same time, there's these whole disciplines which are actually informing the way that we teach language and that we understand language acquisition, which are way behind current practice and what's happening. The third one is Enjoynormativity. And I've put in brackets there and whiteness, because I'll show how these two can link to each other. So the term Enjoynormativity I'm drawing here on the idea of heteronormativity. In other words, the notion that the norm in the world is heterosexuality, that men and women should come together, should produce families, and your life, if you don't fit into that category, is made very difficult. It's difficult in terms of insurance policies, it's difficult in terms of visiting your partner in ICU. There are all sorts of things where your life is made difficult and you're made to feel other through the fact that the world is set up for heterosexuality as the norm. So my argument is that the same thing is applying for English proficiency. The expectation is that people will be and should be proficient in English, and that they are deficient and even deviant if they are not. We could also see it as the compulsory command of English. There's no choices involved. And why I've put whiteness in brackets is that this is not always the case, but certainly in South Africa and very often in other contexts, the kind of English that we're talking about is often linked to an elite racialized register of English, or an ethno-linguistic repertoire of whiteness. So often, the intersections of the normativity of whiteness and the normativity of English come together. Not always, but very often they do come together in language ideologies. And we can see that, for example, in South Africa, in the way that different accents are valued differently, that people are judged as more highly educated if they have an accent that approximates more towards a white South African English accent, for example. Or how daily on the radio, black South African English accents can be used to ridicule people and to imply that what they're saying does not have as much value. Yet, we don't actually take issue with this. Nobody phones into the Human Rights Commission and says, hey, these accents are being used to ridicule somebody. Why? Because of Anglo-normativity and the way that it's linked to the white norms of supposed superiority. So I'm going to show some examples of that in relation to the classroom now. In one grade 1 school, which was in one primary school, which is similar to the suburban school in Johannesburg, but this one is in Cape Town, that it used to be a white school, and now all the children attending the school are black. The teacher said to the researcher, as one child, in grade 1 child, was coming up to tell his news, this is one who couldn't anything, implying that the child couldn't speak when they came to school or had no language. I've had another principal in Johannesburg talking about, well, the children come with no language. There's no child that comes with no communicative resources to school. Absolutely. But what happens is that the system itself and the teacher's limited resources do not enable her to recognize the resources of the child. So she is actually treating a child as having no language when in fact she doesn't have access or hasn't checked what the repertoire is that that child comes from. So instead of being treated as a bilingual or as an emergent bilingual learner, the child is treated as deficient, as having no language. In another example from that classroom, and I do this not so much to show how the teacher is teaching a particular kind of accent as English. And we know that there is no correct pronunciation. In terms of English, we have hundreds of different pronunciations in British Englishes, American Englishes, Australian Englishes, South African Englishes. There is a huge range. There is no one way to pronounce particular words. So the teacher has asked the children who can tell her the date, and Fihle says it's the 2 of August, which is the correct answer, but he hasn't used the ordinal number. No, not the 2, the 2nd. Okay, let's remember, let's count in ordinal numbers, she says. 1st, 2nd, 3rd. And they continue. 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th. Okay, so the vowel sounds that the child are using are coming from his isiXhosa home language, and also the prosody. He's putting the emphasis on the second part in 7th rather than 7th. But are the ordinal numbers correct? Indeed, they are. The teacher has then become so distracted by trying to turn this child's tongue into hers that she has actually lost the focus on the fact that the child has got the ordinal numbers and has got them correctly. And if he says 6th or 6th, 7th or 7th, no one's going to be confused about whether he's got it right or not. So my argument here is that this isn't just about trying to teach children and to assimilate them into a particular kind of pronunciation. It also has negative consequences for pedagogy, because in fact there are moments where teachers then become focused on teaching so-called correct pronunciation rather than actually the content of what they're doing. The high school that the first bit of data came from, high to late, the English head of languages, when I was interviewing her, said this: in an academic class, the brighter girls usually do speak English to each other and lapse into their language less. And what we can see here is a conflation through this of intelligence with and academic achievement with English proficiency. The notion of lapsing as a negative, as in this is something that they have to do rather than that people have chosen to do it. And also the fact that they have the ability, the skill to be able to move across the languages, something that the teacher can't do, becomes a problem in this particular case. Finally, as an example of Anglo-normativity, I want to bring this up to my own institution which is a deeply Anglo-normative space. And just share with you Noluvuyo Mjoli's perspective from Rhodes Must Fall, where she talks about the UCT I envision is the one that won't propel me to speak English all week just to be accepted as intellectually equal to everybody. I envisage a decolonized UCT that will not laugh at me when I present my research paper in isiZulu citing scholars from UKZN. So we can see here that what has shaped a kind of a statement, an expression, a feeling of this student is the Anglo-normativity of the environment, the fact that she feels this way. In 2016, it was 15 actually, in a university in Africa is profoundly disturbing, profoundly disturbing. All right, so how do we shift these deeply entrenched ideologies to acknowledge learners' complex heteroglossic language repertoires and to draw on these in meaningful ways? What might be some decolonial approaches? The first term that I want to introduce here is the one that I've got in my title, languaging for learning, right? Not necessarily multilingualism for learning, but languaging for learning. What do we mean by languaging? People are talking about languaging as a process, both in sociolinguistics and also in psycholinguistics. So in sociolinguistics, referring to the process of using language, whether this is in spoken or written forms, talking about what people do with language. In the psycholinguistic side, Meryl Swain talks about it to replace the idea of comprehensible output as a source of second language learning. We can think of languaging, she says, as an activity, a process of making meaning and shaping knowledge and experience through language. So the verb languaging takes us away from this idea of languages as separate and autonomous in silos and gets us to refocus on languages as resources that people are using to make meaning. What are they doing with language rather than what language are they doing it in, right? So I mentioned earlier that in this new languages of description that have developed, the term translanguaging from Garcia, Makalela, and others has been taken up certainly in education very, very widely. And what they're talking about with translanguaging is the idea of languaging using a wide repertoire, using a full repertoire of language resources. So the act performed by bilinguals of accessing different linguistic features or various modes of, they're saying, what are described as autonomous languages. They're trying to shift. So all the terminology is really signaling a paradigm shift, an ideological shift from the notion of languages as separate, bounded entities to the fluidity of languages in linguistic repertoires. So here the focus is on practices and speakers, as I've said, rather than languages, the use of more than one named language in communication, and the idea that there are no clear-cut boundaries between the languages of bilinguals, that given the opportunity, bilinguals, multilinguals freely use language across their full repertoire. So this is an idea then of dynamic bilingualism rather than additive bilingualism. We're familiar from school language policy of the idea of additive bilingualism, where you keep your home language and then you add on proficiency in other languages. You can see how there's the echo of monolingual ideologies in there, the idea that children come with one and then they add on at school, when in fact children might be coming with more than one already before they even come to school. So the idea of dynamic bilingualism is about including all the resources in the repertoire and not just maintaining, but developing, advancing all the resources in the repertoire. Not just maintaining the home language, but developing, advancing. Okay, so how might we do this in the university sector? Well, I think that there is a lot of innovative work that is already going on. And it's very exciting when you have opportunities to hear about the innovative ways that people are doing things. I mean, a week ago, I was at a translanguaging workshop where I heard colleagues from Rhodes speaking about their use of isiXhosa and English in different programs, not just in the African language programs. At the University of Limpopo, there's the Contemporary English and Multilingual Studies program, where the whole program from first year, second year, and third year into honours now is happening in CPUT and English, bilingual. And then there's also the stuff that students are doing and lecturers who are multilingual are doing every single day, and tutors. Students might have to work in English only when it comes to their assessment and their textbooks, but certainly in their learning, they are not doing that. They are using whatever resources that they have available to them to make meaning with each other, to discuss ideas with each other, and with their tutors and lecturers where that's possible. So we can talk about multilingual classroom discussions, pair and group work, and learning materials being available. And when I say multilingually, but now from the translanguaging kind of perspective, for me, it's not about doing everything equivalently in separate languages. You might be doing different things in different languages. I might be having slides in one language and using some examples in another on different slides, for example. One group might be working in isiXhosa and another one's working in Afrikaans and another one's working in English. It doesn't have to be that everybody is doing everything in all the languages. People are using the resources that they've got. I do think that the admission criteria that we have in higher education could really have a huge impact in terms of breaking the kind of coloniality in the language ideologies that we have. If, for example, coming into an institution like UCT, you got points for the fact that you had an African language in your matric certificate, that would actually raise the status of those languages. And then, if you think about the professions, like the health professions, becoming a doctor, becoming a teacher, what happens in medicine is that in year one, many students have to start learning an African language, and they are only starting at a communicative level, rather than being able to really work with patients around their bodies, around illness, around emotions, and so on. If they had to come in with that proficiency, your African language speakers will already be advantaged because they've got that in terms of coming in, and your non-African language speakers will have to actually come in with that competence from grade 12, so that then they can really develop and build on that competence to actually use African languages in their, with their work with patients, and also likewise teachers with kids in class. And if UCT makes their language admission criteria different, I can tell you now, the schools in the leafy suburbs will have to do that as well, because they have to follow the, so high status institutions have even more responsibility, I think, in actually making changes that really show a valuing of African languages and of multilingualism. I also think that very often the multilingualism is going on informally, whereas in fact we can actually have we can have assessments which require people to come together in groups where they share different language resources, because they can't actually do the assignment without sharing their resources, so that what's valued is not just the English, but all the other resources that are available in that class. I wanted to give an example of the foundation phase PGCE, Postgraduate Certificate in Education. This is a one-year teacher education program at UCT, where the students are currently working on a module in multilingualism and multiliteracies. And about, of the 30 people in that class, 10 have isiXhosa in their linguistic repertoire. So I would say bilingual isiXhosa and English. About 4 bilingual English and Afrikaans. And then the rest see themselves as English monolingual, even though they've taken Afrikaans at school. And that's also interesting, is about who sees themselves as multilingual and as monolingual. Nobody in South Africa can pass school and be monolingual. You can't get a grade 12 certificate. Yet people don't actually acknowledge the resources that they have as well. Why is that? That's also about language ideologies. But in this particular, you can't see it so well, but what happened in this group was that the facilitator divided the students so that in each of the groups, they had the 3 language resources that she wanted them to use in the group work that she was doing: isiXhosa, Afrikaans, and English. And although they had only they'd had a story that she told, and she wanted them to produce action songs and rhymes that they could do with children in grade 1, grade 2, that fitted with the story. And the story was about a beautiful bird and about bringing rain. So that's a bit of the context. But even though many of those students saw themselves as multilingual, others saw themselves as not really being able to bring their isiXhosa into the classroom before the course. After just 2 seminars of the lecturer working across the 3 languages and drawing the linguistic resources out from the students, that group was able to produce different activities where actually there's only 1 song, an action thing that's in English, and the others are in Afrikaans, 2 in Afrikaans, which they made up themselves, and 2 are in isiXhosa, drawing from traditional rhymes and games that the students knew from home. So here's a space where it wasn't possible for that activity to be done in English only. And the students did better because of the different resources that they had to pull in. And I'm amazed to see how things are changing in the class, with English speakers turning to their neighbor when something is going on in the front and saying, "What's that word? Explain to me what that is." But not in a frustrated way, in a very excited way, that actually they're realizing the resources are there collectively amongst them. Have I got 2 minutes? Okay, let me see. What can I do in 2 minutes? Right, I know what I'll do. I think people often talk about the fact that when it comes to translanguaging and moving across languages, or even varieties within one language, that's fine for low-stakes discussion, but not for academic writing and academic publishing. I haven't got time to go through this, but I really would recommend Sami Alim and Geneva Smitherman's book, Articulate While Black, which analyzes the responses to Barack Obama and to how he was constantly positioned as being specially articulate, as if he shouldn't be, and how he moves so amazingly across different varieties of African American English, the mainstream United States English, and also some Spanish, to achieve the incredible speeches that he did. But not only that, but if you look at the way they write themselves, you will see that they, even though this is high-stakes publishing, Oxford University Press, Sami Alim and Geneva Smitherman very successfully draw on their African American vernacular English in their academic writing. And you'll see this throughout the book. It's not just in the preface, it's not just in the introduction. So I urge you to have a look at that. I think I want to rather read this poem to end off with, which is showing how it's not that the single standard language is something that's you have to get to in the end, because often it's about translanguaging and bringing resources together that itself makes the meaning much more powerfully. And I think that's the case in this particular poem, which was written by a Soweto school learner, Sunny Boy, as he calls himself, and he has, it's been published in the Tabua Poetry Collection, which came from this project on multilingual multiliteracies. So he calls it the Songa Me, and he says, "I am discriminated against and underestimated. My tongue has made me a stranger. My tongue has created enemies for me. Though I have been born to be a king, my tongue has made me a slave. On the television program, news is available. Indaba is available. Titabe is available. Where is Timhaku? On the electrical plant, notice is dangerous. Notice is Khafar. Notice is Ngozi. Where is the notice for Kombo? South African news is about the West. Where is my Limpopo province situated? The rejected stone turns out to be the chief stone. the broken Sangami, the rejected Sangami, the despised Sangami, the wounded Sangami. I will rise with the power of Chris Hani. If racism is the race that I must run, I am determined and devoted to run the race. And I think we can see the power of bringing the languages together in this particular poem. He cannot make that meaning in English only. So thank you very much. That's my end.